I have been developing Project Mycer for quite a while at this point, and while the game is still pretty far off, I knew that before I made any more significant progress, I needed to figure out the answer to this question. Is this game even fun? When you're developing your own game, obviously you can try to answer that yourself by just playing your own game, but that only goes so far because however I perceive my game may not necessarily be the way that others do. So to find the answer to this question, I create a short playtest demo and send it to a few people to play through and offer their honest feedback. So for this devlog, I want to go over what this playtest demo entailed, how I set up the feedback process, and what I ultimately did about that feedback. My name is Skylar Fox, and this is Project Mycer. For those new to the channel, which statistically speaking is going to be most people watching, Project Mycer is a 3D action-adventure superhero game that I am making with Unreal Engine. It is a very combat-heavy game, and so it is important that this area feels good. While there are other important categories such as traversal, NPC interaction, and overall story content, combat is really what's likely going to make or break this game in a lot of ways. Because of this, I made a plan to create a short 5 to 10 minute demo focused solely on the combat of the game. I created a very simple fighting arena with a dome on a platform, and made a tournament-style gameplay loop. The player will start with a brief tutorial for what buttons relate to which actions, and there are some test dummy enemies to beat up. But once the player has completed this, they will encounter waves of enemies in 6 rounds, and then a final 7th round where they will fight against the game's first boss. The idea is to have players fight with a different variety of combinations of enemies and number of enemies, starting from small encounters and ending with larger encounters. Part of the purpose of this playtest is I wanted to try and stretch just how many enemies I could reasonably make for these encounters within this relatively small space before the player gets too overwhelmed and frustrated. I wanted to pinpoint exactly what the limits were that I should enforce when designing encounters for the full game. Once I had finished up and I had the demo ready, I then had to choose who exactly was going to play this. Friends are a pretty easy target, but obviously you have to be careful about who you select because depending on the relationship, the feedback that they give could be biased or at least less honest, and it may cause them to withhold some actual criticisms they have. But on the flip side, you also have to be careful that the criticisms that anyone does give actually align with the game's goals. Fantasy author Brandon Sanderson has spoken about how to give good critique, and explained that critique is helpful when the author's goals are understood and the critic is offering feedback that helps the author write a better version of the story they're writing, instead of offering feedback that suggests that the author just changed what the story even is. And honestly, a lot of gamers suffer from this problem, and even I myself can find myself falling into this trap if I don't like something. In the end, the selection of people that I chose to play the demo was a mixture of friends, coworkers, and friends of friends whom I had no real relationship with. Coworkers in particular was one I wanted to target because I work in QA, so our job is to write bugs and assess and report on a product's quality. As such, my coworkers are more likely to assess what the game actually is trying to do and can give feedback that makes sense for the game's design intentions, and not feedback that can sort of just be summed up as, oh, make a different kind of game. I contacted these individuals, sent them a download for the demo, and provided them with a Google Docs feedback form filled with different questions and information that they can fill out. And so now I'd just like to take some time to review some of this feedback together. So one of the things that was important to me with the survey is that in the responses, we can see the actual numbers for who did what, but we don't actually see any names attached to that. And I made sure that I told this to the people that were going to be giving feedback because I didn't want them to feel like, oh, their name was going to be attached to any particular question or answer. I wanted it to feel mostly anonymous so that they felt 100% comfortable just saying how they truly felt. And so when it came to this question of what difficulty mode did you play with, it seems like we actually got a fairly even amount of answers here. We had one person who played in story mode, which is meant to be kind of like very, very, very easy. Most people played in beginner mode. We got 3 people here. And then 2 people played on intermediate and 2 people played on hard. And we also have which control schemes did you play with? 2 played on controller and 6 played on mouse and keyboard, which makes sense. I kind of anticipate that mouse and keyboard would be the most because when you're playing on PC, most people are just, they're not going to want to bother hooking up a controller, which is a little unfortunate because a lot of the way that this game was designed is with a controller in mind. Not to say that it's unplayable with mouse and keyboard, but it is possible that this could reflect some of the results. But what we see here others, the controls were easy to understand and felt responsive. The good news is that most people strongly agree. That's 5 for strongly agree. We got 2 for somewhat agree, and only 1 for neither agree or disagree. So the good news is no one was in the disagree category, so at the very least I feel pretty good about that. And then over here, we can actually get some specific feedback about problems with the controls. Some people actually said the default controls for mouse and keyboard felt natural. When changing the buttons with the mouse and keyboard, there were a few errors. That I anticipated because I do have a key bindings feature implemented, but it is still very early and I know that there are already bugs with it. And that's kind of one thing that's important to know with getting feedback, is that a lot of times, even if you give certain caveats ahead of time, you're going to get feedback that you're already going to know that's wrong with your game, especially when it's early in progress. But it's still good to get these responses just so you can know to make it a priority. 2 of these actually mentioned a jump bug, and this was actually really helpful to call out because this was a bug that I myself had not been able to reproduce before, and I actually had to spend some time investigating this bug and figuring out what exactly it was that was going on. Now this description says, while locked onto an enemy, if I performed a jump attack, I could not jump again till I performed a ground attack. Because of this, I played the rest of my session without targeting. That makes this a pretty bad issue because targeting is kind of a very key part of combat in this game. It's definitely designed very similar to like a Kingdom Hearts game where you're frequently going to be choosing which target you want to attack. Now this is kind of one of those questions where after I figured out what was causing the bug, this is one of those funny things that you learn with like the relationship between QA and development, right? Is that, you know, we can say that a bug is out there, a bug exists. Doesn't necessarily mean that the repro steps are 100% accurate, because they mentioned that the bug was related to locking onto an enemy and performing a jump attack. And I was able to reproduce this bug without locking onto an enemy at all. What the bug was that sometimes if you're in the air and you attack and you're just above the ground, meaning that your attack animation is still playing a little bit towards the end as you have already landed on the ground, it means that there's a very particular variable that says, hey, the player can jump, that is supposed to be re-enabled after the player lands, but it's getting skipped because the player landed while their attack animation was occurring. Once I figured out that was what was causing the problem, I was able to fix it. But apparently they just assumed that it was related to locking onto enemies, and it really wasn't. And unfortunately it's going to skew some of the results of this, but that's another thing that's important to know with looking at feedback, is knowing the context behind why people are giving answers. Whenever you're setting up feedback forms like this, I always recommend that not only do you have questions like these where they have very clear pre-written answers, but you ask them sort of why, like why did the game feel like this, or what were the things that you didn't like about it, because that's going to give you some clear indicators as to why they gave the answer that they did, so you can better understand the data. Because if you don't understand the data, you can be making choices that are counterproductive. So player attacks and combos were enjoyable. This is a 50-50 split between strongly agree and somewhat agree, which I am really happy with, because that was kind of the whole point of this playtest demo, is to test to see, does combat feel good? And it looks like it does, so that's really good to see. Player dodging and guarding behaved as expected and felt good to use. So we had 50% were strongly agree. The other 50% in total were a little more mixed. We had 2 that were somewhat agree and 1 that was somewhat disagree. 1 that said strongly disagree, which is really interesting. Whenever you get an outlier like this, obviously if it's not the majority, you don't have to panic too much. But it is one of those things where sometimes I like to look individually. And you can kind of go through the pages to see who responded in what way, which could maybe give you some helpful context for like why they felt dodging or guarding didn't feel good to use, or something like that, Another thing I actually kind of regret with this question is I combine dodging and guarding into the same question when they really should have been separate questions, because they are different mechanics. They don't really function the same way. I should have anticipated that it's entirely possible that a player could find dodging good but guarding not good, and vice versa. And so that's something I'll have to remember for future playtests. Enemies felt appropriately challenging according to my chosen difficulty mode. Most strongly agree, 2 somewhat agree, and then only 1 strongly disagreed. And I did check this, the one that said strongly disagree played on the hardest difficulty mode. And that's one of those things where I'm going to just kind of play it out, see what happens in future playtests, because that's kind of one of those things that if players are playing this on hard mode, especially like in a 5 to 10 minute demo, no one's played this game before, they might have a hard time, right? It's hard mode, and so it could just be that they were weren't used to it or they were getting too frustrated. But hard mode on one hand is supposed to be kind of hard. That's why it's called hard. So it's a little tough to see whether or not this is going to be all that valid yet. So I'm going to put a pin on it, say, hey, this might be a concern, but let's not worry too much about it right now. We'll get to it when we get to it. And then similarly, we had boss fight felt appropriately difficult as a first boss fight for the game, as well as being appropriate for the difficulty mode chosen. Once again, I know that the strongly disagree came from the one who played in hard. Who was your favorite enemy to fight? Interestingly enough, it's kind of split pretty evenly, which I wasn't really expecting. We had 3 people with the street criminals and 3 people with the boss fight, and then 2 people for the armed soldiers with guns. We can get some insight into looking at like, oh, why was it your favorite enemy? So some people liked that Miklos could block enemy attacks. Someone said they took a little time to fire the gun, but other than that, it was good. Street criminals were predictable and rarely display stun immunity. Armed soldiers were difficult to deal with in any crowd, so I had to single them out individually. Navigation for all enemies broke while I was mid-air, so I just jumped, dashed in close, air combo, rinse, and repeat. So navigation breaking for all enemies while being in mid-air was actually a good bug to call out because it wasn't something I quite caught before, and I realized what was happening was in the AI behavior trees, when it's looking for a task for, hey, navigate to this area where the player is, I set the radius really small because I didn't want their goal to be like, oh, they could be far away from the player and that would count. But as a result of this meant that if the player was really high in the air, well, there's no navigatable spot for the AI to go to because the player's in the air. So I basically just added another value that said, hey, if they can't reach it from here, then try this higher value, like 2,000, 3,000 or something like that. And now enemies will still move around and they won't just break their navigation even if you're in air. So there's another one that said their favorite was the armed soldiers. They actually felt like they provided a good amount of difficulty, but they disliked the amount that would appear during rounds as it made difficult to deal with them when they would all shoot at you. And parentheses may have something to do with the fact that the players do not start rounds with full health. And that's another thing that I do kind of wish I maybe changed with the demo a little bit is that in the tutorial, you restore your full health at the end before you go to the tournament, but each round you retain the same amount of health that you do. And currently there is no system in place to allow the player to recover their health. There's no like healing system or anything, at least not yet. That's something I'm still kind of brainstorming exactly how I want to go about that. But because of that, I do think that this influenced just how difficult this demo really was for a lot of people because they had to essentially kind of play through each round without dying, or else they had to risk restarting the whole thing. I do think this one was pretty funny. They didn't gun me down like a dog, and I assume that is referring to the street criminals. But yeah, then there's what was your least favorite enemy to fight? Similarly, it's also pretty split. Street criminals was 4, and then the boss fight was 2, and the armed soldiers was 2. For street criminals, it seemed like most people didn't like them because they just seemed really basic, which makes sense. They are meant to be the most basic enemy. A lot of the feedback that I saw was that some of the soldiers, like their attack tells, are not clear, and the attempts per time spent is significant. So for those who have seen my prior videos, you may have remembered a video I made on the armed soldier enemies and how difficult it was for me to really try to design them in a way that made them feel fun and fair. And there were a lot of things I wanted to try to avoid. I wanted to make sure that any tells that they had for attacks came from their animations. I didn't want a very obvious like UI indicator like you see in the Spider-Man video game or the Batman Arkham video games where it's like, ooh, this flashy thing that tells you they're about to fire, but press this button now to instantly dodge. You know, I didn't want it to be quite that easy. And so it's tough trying to figure that out. So there were a couple things I did to try to fix this. One was I tried to make sure that the armed soldiers, if there was 2 other armed soldiers that were already firing at you, that the rest of them shouldn't fire at you at all. That was something I really had to kind of nail down that hard-in rule. Another is I wanted to make the attack tell a little bit more obvious, and one of the ways that I did that is I kind of added this little flashing light that actually appears on the gun of the armed soldier. I was debating in my mind whether or not I wanted to do this because I was like, well, this kind of feels a little similar to like the player having an exclamation mark over their head, but I think it works a little bit in this case because it is attached to the gun itself, so it's not like permanently in a set location on screen, so you still have to notice it, you still have to look for it, and it does stand out a lot more. So I feel like it behaves more similarly to having an animation tell rather than a UI tell. But hopefully this actually helps in kind of making the enemies a little bit easier to fight or more manageable to fight. A lot of the other questions and answers were related to game performance, and thankfully it seems that we're pretty good for performance here. We had 8 that said strongly agreed, consistent frame rate, no hitches, crashes, etc., which is awesome. Audio had good feedback. I'll have another devlog where I actually talk about audio because I actually had a coworker friend of mine who actually assisted with audio for this game, and especially for this playtest demo. That's likely going to be the next devlog that I release. And then over here, down to overall thoughts. After playing this early demo, where would you rate your overall interest or excitement in Project Mycer as a game? So here we only have 2 that say highly interested, 4 that say somewhat interested, 1 that said neither interested or disinterested, and 1 that said somewhat disinterested. So thankfully it seems like most people after playing this were at least somewhat interested. There are some things I think I could do to bump that up to highly interested. I do think that for the scope of this demo, it's a little hard to get a highly interested mark because of how early everything is. But obviously highly interested is going to be kind of the goal, is that I could bump this 50% to become blue instead of red in this case. Then we get who would you say is the target audience for this kind of game, and some of the responses here were pretty interesting. We get some that make sense, like comic fans, action RPG fans, indie kind of gamers. I found it interesting that Lego games got brought up multiple times. We got Lego games here. We had Lego games mentioned here when someone said what game would be most comparable to this, so it said reminds me of Lego games or Castle Crashers, which is a very interesting comparison. I'll be real, I'm not sure where they're getting Castle Crashers vibes, but we got Lego games here, Lego games here, and another that said Lego games. I said not knocking on it as I love Lego games, so like just they want to make sure I knew it wasn't a negative thing. But I did think that was interesting because Lego wasn't necessarily on my mind when designing this game. I do love the Lego games. I grew up playing them. I grew up playing all the Lego Star Wars games, had a lot of fun with them. But it's interesting to see that that is what this reminded them of. It doesn't seem to be a bad thing as far as I can tell, but it is kind of an interesting comparison. You know, some people gave in like what they figured age range would be. Like some say teens to young adults, some said kids age 4 to 8, some said mid-teens to adults. And I would say between like kids to teens is around what I'm targeting. This isn't going to be an M-rated game. There's not really any gore or anything like that. It is definitely meant to be aimed kind of more at like an E10 to T-rated level is kind of what I'm going at. So at least as far as that goes, I seem to be spot on there. I'm not introducing anything that makes people think wildly different conclusions for who the target is of this game. And at the end, I also added some sections here where people could either add, hey, if you could, what are some features that you think would be cool to see in Project Mycer, or any features in the game you'd like to see changed or removed, as well as some general questions about any other feedback that they would like to leave that aren't previously covered. Some people listed bugs in here, which were really good. Many mentioned the mouse and keyboard controls, which makes sense again, because I primarily designed the game with a controller in mind, and so there were some things with mouse and keyboard that were a little bit lacking to a lot of people, especially when it came to UI navigation. And so it's going to have to be some stuff that I work on later. It should also be noted that there were a few others who played the game who also offered me their feedback, but they did so either by telling me directly or through DMs. But for the most part, their feedback matches a lot of what I have seen in this feedback form. All in all, I thought this playtest demo went fairly well. I didn't really get particularly roasted beyond repair, but I also don't think the responses felt dishonest, and there was some fair critique given. But I also think one of the things that's always important when getting feedback is to recognize the full context behind why they are saying the things they are saying, both for negative or for positive. And this isn't just so you have an excuse to dismiss negative feedback, but it is so you can discern what the important issues really are. Because even if someone is calling out something that is inaccurate, such as the player who thought lock-on was broken because they mistakenly related it to a jumping bug, they still called out an important bug to fix, and it was only through that feedback that I even discovered the bug existed. Thankfully, the core foundation of the game's combat seems to be solid enough that nobody thought it was outright terrible, so now I can safely move forward with development on other areas of the game while still making small improvements to the combat as I go. It's also really helpful because now I have a good idea on what my limits are when designing future encounters. Eventually in the future, I plan on doing another playtest, and it's possible I might be opening this up to more people, including any of you who are watching right now. So if this project interests you and you want to keep up on its development, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you all have a great day.